I am sick of treating resilience like it's some kind of badge of honor. I think we've made resilience a little too heroic. Someone works nights, takes on another project, juggles 5 competing priorities, and is pushing through the exhaustion. And what do we call them? Resilient. But I don't think your employees need more resilience. I think your organization needs to get better at prioritizing change. Because when people say, I can't take on anything else, we already have too much going on, leaders often hear resistance. But what if they're actually hearing capacity concerns? What if people aren't saying, I won't do this? What if they're actually saying, I don't have room for this? Because one of the biggest mistakes leaders make is assuming change fails because people resist it. In reality, change often fails because people can't sustain it. And that's what we're talking about today. How to lead change when everyone is already overloaded, and why one of the most important leadership responses isn't pushing harder, it's prioritizing better. If we haven't met before, I'm Teena, founder of Change Decoded. I've spent my career helping leaders just like yourself turn ambitious visions into lasting results, guiding teams through technology transformation, acquisitions, organizational change, and periods of significant growth. And if there's one thing those experiences have taught me, it's this. Transformation isn't something that happens to an organization. It happens through its people, because organizations don't transform. The people do. And when people respond to change, they're often communicating information. That's the foundation of the Resistance Decoder, a framework designed to help leaders understand what different forms of resistance are actually trying to tell us. Today's theme is capacity resistance, the resistance that says, I don't have room for this. And the leadership response is prioritize, because before people can successfully adopt change, leaders need to create space for it. Before we dive in, I just want to let you know that I create a free change agent toolkit to help leaders identify resistance signals and respond more effectively during transformation. You'll find the link in the description below. When change initiatives struggle, leaders often ask, how do we get people more engaged? How do we reduce the resistance? How do we increase adoption? And those aren't bad questions, but sometimes they are the wrong questions, because the real issue isn't always whether people support the change. Sometimes the issue is whether they have the capacity to absorb it. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever had something genuinely important that you wanted to do, but simply didn't have the room for? It could be a new certification, a health goal, a home project, a volunteer commitment. The issue wasn't motivation. The issue was capacity. And organizations and teams experience the same exact thing. One of the most common explanations for failed transformation efforts is resistance. The people didn't buy in, the people weren't committed, the people didn't adopt. But I think there's something deeper happening. People are often reacting to the experience of the change itself, not the change, but the experience. And that's a very important distinction, because how change feels often determines how sustainable it becomes. When people feel overwhelmed, exhausted, confused, or constantly pulled in different directions, they're not just responding to the initiative. They're responding to the experience of trying to survive it. And that's where capacity resistance often begins. One of the most important concepts I teach is tempo. Tempo is the rhythm of how change unfolds across an organization. Most leaders think about speed, but sustainable transformation isn't really about speed. It's about the rhythm. Because people don't experience strategy. People experience tempo. They experience how quickly priorities change, how often new initiatives appear, how long the decisions take, how much work they're expected to absorb at once. And when that tempo is off, change begins to feel chaotic, even when the strategy itself is sound. I've sat through a lot of change postmortems over the years. Different teams, different strategies, different projects, same conversation. At some point, someone in the room says, we just moved too fast. I look around, everyone is nodding in agreement. Case closed. But I don't think speed is usually the problem. The real question is, too fast for whom? Because every transformation has three things happening all at once: the pace leadership is setting, the rate the organization can absorb the change, and the employee experience happening somewhere in between. When those three things fall out of sync, things start to wobble. Execution becomes messy, adoption becomes inconsistent, and people start looking resistant when they're actually trying. The system is simply carrying more than it realistically can. One of the reasons capacity resistance gets misdiagnosed is because it sounds a lot like resistance. You hear things like, "We don't have time. We are already stretched too thin. Can this just wait till next quarter?" Notice what isn't being said. People aren't saying, "I don't believe in this." They're saying, "I don't know where this fits in." Those are two very different messages. One is about commitment, the other is about capacity. One of the easiest ways to identify capacity resistance is to listen for overload language. Listen for phrases like, "everything is urgent," "I don't know what to focus on." These aren't usually engagement problems, they're capacity signals. They're telling you that the organization may be absorbing more change than it can realistically sustain. And that's important information. In the video popping up on your screen, I introduced the Resistance Decoder, which addresses the 6 other types of resistance and why it is important to respond differently to each one. Most organizations don't notice capacity problems until they're already affecting performance, but the signals tend to show up in predictable ways. One pattern is the sprint and stall cycle. Teams push hard, then they pause. Then they sprint, then they pause. People experience organizational whiplash. Another pattern is constant urgency mode. Everything is critical. Everything is important. Everything needs attention now. Eventually, urgency loses its meaning. People stop responding because they no longer know what actually matters. Decision bottlenecks? That's another signal. Teams are ready to move, but decisions are lagging. Then, once direction arrives, everyone is expected to move immediately. And finally, there is change saturation. Too many initiatives, too many priorities, too many messages. Honestly, too much competing for the same limited attention. These often get labeled as execution problems, but many times they're actually experience problems. Let's imagine a team already implementing a major technology platform. At the same time, a process redesign launches. A restructuring begins. And now a new reporting requirement arrives. And yet, another strategic initiative is also announced. Every one of those initiatives may be important. Every one of those may have a strong business case. Every one may deserve attention. But together, they exceed the team's capacity. The response often sounds like resistance, but what employees are really saying is, "I don't know what to prioritize. I don't know what can wait. I don't know how to do all of this all at once." Those are capacity signals. Those are not commitment signals. This is why the leadership response to capacity resistance is prioritize. Not pressure, not urgency, not asking people to be more resilient. Prioritize. Because every time we add something new, we are making a decision about attention. Time, energy, focus. The problem is that many organizations add priorities without removing priorities. The list grows, the workload grows, the expectation grows, but capacity doesn't. At some point, people stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What can I realistically survive?" That's not a motivational problem. That's a prioritization problem. Great leaders understand that if everything is important, nothing is important. They create clarity. They make trade-offs visible. They help teams understand what matters most now because people can handle hard work. What they struggle with is trying to give equal attention to everything all at the same time. One of the most powerful questions a leader can ask during change is, What needs to move off the plate before this moves on to it? Because prioritization isn't about deciding what matters, it's about deciding what matters most. First, clarify priorities. Before introducing something new, ask what can stop, what can wait, what can we move to a later phase, what can be removed from the plate before we add something else. Because prioritization isn't about deciding what matters, it's about deciding what matters most. Second, create predictable cadence. Humans naturally look for patterns, consistent communication, consistent decision checkpoints, consistent rhythms. Predictability reduces cognitive load and helps people navigate uncertainty. Third, listen for energy signals. Fatigue is feedback. Frustration is feedback. Confusion is feedback. Disengagement is also feedback. Those aren't annoyances to ignore. They're signals to decode. And fourth, reinforce priorities relentlessly. Because priorities aren't what leaders announce. They're what leaders consistently reinforce. When everything is urgent, people don't gain clarity, they gain anxiety. Clarity often moves faster than pressure. When leaders misdiagnose capacity resistance, they often respond by pushing harder. More meetings, more urgency, more pressure. But pressure doesn't create capacity. It simply exposes the lack of it. Eventually, people stop raising concerns, not because they're on board, but because they're exhausted. And that's a dangerous place for transformation to be. Because burnout is not resilience, exhaustion is not commitment, and survival mode is not sustainable adoption. The biggest shift capacity resistance asks us to make as a leader is this: stop asking, why aren't people moving faster? And start asking, what needs to come off the plate? Because capacity resistance isn't usually saying, I won't do this. It's often saying, I don't have room for this. And those are two very different conversations. When leaders respond with more pressure, resistance grows. When leaders respond with more prioritization, capacity begins to return. And that's when sustainable momentum becomes possible. The next time someone tells you they're overloaded, pause before labeling it resistance. Ask yourself, is this a commitment problem or a capacity problem? Because change doesn't fail simply because people resist it. More often, it fails because people can't sustain it. The goal isn't to ask people to carry more. The goal is to help them focus on what matters most. Because sustainable change doesn't happen when everything is a priority. It happens when leaders have the courage to make priorities clear. If this video was helpful, subscribe to the channel and download the free Change Agent Toolkit using the link in the description. And let me know in the comments, what's something your organization needs to stop doing before it takes on something new? Until next time, remember, resistance is information. Every response to change is a signal. The job of a leader is to decode the message. I'm here to help. Let's decode change together and lead change inside and out.